Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all of you very warmly to this afternoon session on export controls. And just briefly to introduce myself, my name is Sibylle Bauer, and I work for SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, on dual use and arms trade control issues. And the issue that we are discussing this afternoon has actually been touched upon in many different ways already in the plenary session, because it's quite a cross-cutting issue. It's relevant for the Iran discussion, relevant for the chemical weapons discussion, and it came up in most interventions actually in some direct or indirect way that we already heard today. And I would like to put this session under the very broad title of Trends and Challenges. But actually, when I saw the name of this room, Evasion and Innovation, and I believe actually it was in the same room already last year, I thought that could also be a very appropriate title for the session. There's certainly plenty of evasion in export controls. That's been an ongoing trend for many, many years. And I think we've also seen a great deal of innovation, both from the proliferators that have found creative ways to evade controls, but also from international regional organizations and national governments that have found creative, innovative ways to address these evasions and to find new ways to address the challenges. And we actually have a huge range of potential issues that we could discuss under the heading of export controls, because it encompasses dual use and it also includes conventional arms. But I think because we already had a session on small arms, and we will have another one on ATT tomorrow, we should focus on the issues that are not covered by the other two panels, and that, of course, leaves plenty of other issues that we could focus on here. And because the request from the previous years always has been to make it as interactive as possible and to leave plenty of scope for questions, the presenters were asked to refrain from giving PowerPoint presentations, and they were also asked to limit their remarks, if possible, to 5 minutes. In the previous sessions, this was up to 10 minutes. So hopefully we will have plenty of time for discussion after that. And the chairs were asked not to read out the bios from the presenters, but I would still like to briefly explain some of the background, because I think it's very useful for the discussion. It's very useful to know what kind of questions you could put to the panel that we have here. And I would like to start with Angelina. She's from the Malaysian Licensing Authority, and Malaysia is a country that has only recently introduced export and strategic trade controls in 2010, and I think therefore, there's a lot of very fresh thought in interesting new ways of approaching this issue. And one of the big headaches for Malaysia has been how to deal with transshipment controls. So I think that will be a very interesting issue to discuss with Angelina. Next, we have Kiessler, who's one of the 1540 committee experts. But I should also say a few words about his previous background, because previous to that, he worked for Bauer, the German licensing authority, and he's dealt with dual-use licensing issues there, but also spent a lot of time on capacity building in different parts of the world. And then last but certainly not least, we have Spencer Chilvers, who's our industry representative on the panel from Royce. But also Spencer is not only an industry representative, but actually he spent many, many, many years in government, also with the licensing authority, dealing not only with dual-use issues and actually being one of the people who negotiated the current dual-use regulation, actually Kai as well, but also dealing with firearms issues, brokering issues, in a range of different regulatory issues. So I think we don't only have three perspectives on the panel, but we actually have, through the three speakers, multiple perspectives. And I look forward to trying to make the most out of that during the discussion and the time that we have later. So with that, I would like to ask Kai to start, because he will start with the more international perspective and giving an overview of that, and then we will zoom in on a national perspective and finish with industry. So Kai, you have the floor.
Many thanks, Sibylle. Good afternoon. Let me start by saying, because this is I have to say this. I'm going to give my personal opinion here. I'm not going to talk on behalf of the committee. So it may be more interesting. And also, to start off, it's my job. I have to tell you a bit about 1540, especially this is the 10-year anniversary of this resolution. Also, I was a bit disappointed that the organizers didn't devote a special session to that, because it would have been fitting to discuss, what has been achieved, and there's still a lot to come. So allow me to say why Sibylle has invited me here. And so just a few words on those people who are not so familiar with 1540 that has been mentioned also this morning. So it was a reaction to different things, 9/11, also information about terrorists trying to acquire weapons of mass destruction, but also, we should not forget this, revelations about non-state actors dealing with these materials, so proliferation networks. It's a Chapter 7 resolution, which means it's binding on all states, and it's meant to address the threat posed by non-state actors acquiring, dealing, handling with weapons of mass destruction. I'm saying non-state actors. Sometimes it's perceived to be simply a terrorist resolution, but it's terrorist, and you can think of criminal organizations, whatever. So it's a broader range. The key obligations, very short: don't support non-state actors trying to acquire these WMD, or prohibit all WMD-related activities, and also establish domestic controls over WMD-relevant material. And the 4 pages of the resolutions don't show it, but somebody counted it. It contains about 200 legal obligations, if you look at that. And so under these domestic controls, we have measures relating to physical protection, securing of materials, accounting of materials, and of course, and that's why I'm here, export and border controls. I think over the years, you can say actually now that 1540 has developed to be one of the key pillars of the international regulatory environment with regard to export controls, because it applies to all states, and also it has been, and we can see this, an impetus for a lot of states, for a lot of developments, for a lot of states to review, to update, or to establish export controls. It's also not only about exports, we should say that, it's also about related activities. So we are also looking at brokering, transit, transshipment controls, also proliferation financing, so there's a number of issues related to that. And it really identifies the key aspects of what is now considered a state-of-the-art export control system. You need legislation in place, including penalties. You need some kind of enforcement capacity. And also, you should establish you're encouraged to develop some industry-government relations. Very important, the resolution only says what states have to do. It doesn't say how. And that's, of course, a big challenge, as we all saw. Now, what is the 1540 committee, or the experts supporting this committee? What are they doing in that area? So we have a number of different tasks. The first one, a very important one, is of course monitoring the national implementation of the resolution, and this includes also trying to follow up all the developments in the export control field. It's also trying to provide support to states in a number of different ways. Most importantly, the committee and the experts are supposed to be matchmakers for assistance or cooperation partnerships. It's also about establishing partnerships with international organizations or arrangements in the area to see how the resolution can be implemented. And also one thing that I'd like to mention at this point is that the committee has also the task to actually compile effective implementation practices, and I will come back to that later. So now just a bit on the 10-year anniversary, and including I'm going to talk a bit on the export controls, some personal observations. I think what we can see now, and thanks to previous experts like Volker Beck here, we can say that actually the resolution is now very widely accepted. We have a very high record in reporting, which is in a sign of a commitment. So I think we're missing only 20 states who've never reported to the 1540 Committee, which is a very good thing for UN Security Council resolutions. We can also see that there's still developments on the status of implementation continues to improve. You can also say that the resolution helped to strengthen what I should now call the network of non-proliferators, because it brought people together. It has been the umbrella for a great number of initiatives to support the process on a national basis, but also by international organizations. But of course, the job is not done. It's a long-term task, also in view of new challenges. And let me talk quickly about export controls. There's very encouraging developments. For example, on international efforts, we're very happy to see, for example, the WCO getting very engaged now in the area of strategic trade controls, as they call it. I should say, finally, it took them long enough. And also the implementation, national implementation, we can see, or I can see also, it still varies very greatly. We have some real success stories like Malaysia. We also have good efforts in the United Arab Emirates establishing a system. I should also mention Mexico recently joining some arrangements. Also the southeastern European states, I think, so it's quite some tremendous success. We can see others which are constantly updating, for example, the EU recently with a new communication on how they perceive the export controls in the next couple of years. Of course, the US with also updating their export control system measures in Japan. But I can also see a very slow progress in some other states where export controls are not seen as a priority. It's still the traditional old perceptions that export controls are hindering trade or unfair practice, which is quite a challenge. So can also see that the implementation does require a lot from states. It requires political will. It requires a lot of stamina to work on that, to implement that. It requires institutions and capacities and interagency cooperation, which is not very easy to achieve, and the lack of capacity remains a key challenge. I'm also wondering, sometimes when I go to these conferences, I see that there's still a very flawed understanding of some key concepts of export controls. Also wonder sometimes if there's maybe a waning interest now after these 10 years, so maybe something to think about as well. So as an outlook, I think we need more efforts, we need more cooperation programs, we need more positive things like the EU supporting the implementation by various programs on the export control side, but also through the centers of excellence. We see we will need work and involvement on different levels, also including industry, and I'm glad to see that, for example, Germany has initiated a way to formalize a relationship with industry to bring their voice into the process. We may also need to think about adapting some of the concepts to think about how we can make export controls maybe more fitting for regional circumstances, and also to reflect maybe on how we can better explain some concepts, maybe to better explain catch-alls, ITT, not always start how complicated this is, but really tell about the benefits of these very innovative or still very flexible instruments. And if I may just quickly finish with a call on the participants here to please continue to support the 1540 process by keeping the agenda on the issue on the agenda, and also to share effective practices. I was talking about these effective practices. The 1540 committee or the 1540 process is really a great platform for bringing together, for discussing how you can implement this very complex resolution, and for sharing of information. And that's where I think, for example, the EU has a number of effective practices. Maybe they're a bit shy to share them, but the EU list has developed into an international standard, which is useful for a number of states. I also personally think that what the EU has developed in terms of the legal text for transit and brokering controls, it's a very flexible concept. Maybe we're lacking some implementation experience, but it's still, these are good practices that it would be great to share them with a wider people. And also the EU is an excellent example how you can organize regional cooperation, how you can help each other and share information. I'd like to raise your attention also that the next big thing after the 10-year anniversary will be that we're looking now at the upcoming comprehensive review of the resolution, of the implementation of the resolution, which is supposed to be finished by 2016. And that's a chance for everyone to bring in opinions, voices, especially now talking in the context of the Non-Proliferation Consortium, bring in new ideas, talk about new challenges, unfortunately you took away the joke with the evasion and innovation, because one aspect you missed maybe is, of course, the innovation is also the innovations in trade and global supply chains, but also in terms of things like 3D printing, synthetic biology, which are posing a whole lot new challenges that may be also worthwhile looking into in the 1540 process. And with that, I will finish now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kai. Plenty of food for thought there. And it's actually a good transition to Angelina's presentation, because you mentioned that maybe export controls could also be fitted to the regional context, and you talked about sharing EU experience, and Angelina can share Southeast Asian, ASEAN, Malaysian experiences. And I think it's always interesting to benefit from the thinking that has gone into new regulations. Often what I think in countries that have had export controls for many decades, it's more of a patchwork that's done to fix things and to adjust to new trends. And countries that recently introduced export controls actually have the opportunity to really think from scratch. How would I design a system with the knowledge that we have now and with the reality that we face now? So with that, I hand the floor to Angelina. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sibylle. I have my speaking notes typed out, but to make it interactive, I look up once in a while. All right. Speaking of export controls today, I would like to relate to Malaysia's experience and approach. Some of you would agree with me that even the term export control has a negative connotation. So in a major trading nation such as Malaysia, no business would be thrilled if the government told them that their exports may be controlled. Exports, transit and transshipment are major trading activities in Malaysia. Coming from the Ministry of Trade, I view trade security and trade promotion as two sides of the same coin. So instead of the Export Control Act, we just call it the Strategic Trade Act, hoping that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. The US, Australia, Japan, and the EU have long implemented trade security-related regulations. Now in ASEAN, Singapore implemented the Strategic Goods Act in 2008. And Malaysia's Strategic Trade Act came into force in 2011. Other economies in ASEAN are at various stages of implementation of export control. The ASEAN economies are either major or emerging trading markets that cannot afford to compromise on trade security. But at the same time, they cannot risk legitimate trading activities that are crucial for our economic development to be adversely affected. Now, I think it is safe to say that this is the case everywhere. Not surprising then that export controls are juxtaposed with the domestic precepts in line with the national agenda. One size does not fit all. There are unique national interests as well as geopolitical conditions to contend with. For example, Malaysia's very strategic position along a very busy trading route in Southeast Asia is a critical factor to our ensuring of a safe and secure trading environment. Good regulatory practices are a must. Malaysia's Strategic Trade Act is based on the best of the different export control laws of the world, an inverted process because we learn from the mistakes of others, but we also make our own. Because before we apply what we have learned from others, we need to acclimatize to our trading environment and culture. To do this, a good government-industry relationship is essential. Both sides hold different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, and for the puzzle to be solved, they have to be matched. Grounded on such principles, we have reviewed our regulations based on inputs from the private sector. We have targeted the low-lying fruits first. We have already simplified procedures and introduced flexibilities according to different business models. And now a major review of the Strategic Trade Act is underway. This exercise is expected to be completed in the first quarter of next year. Among the elements for review include redefinition of brokering, introduction of administrative penalties, since Malaysia currently holds the record for having the harshest penalties for export control violation. We are also working on introducing practical measures for compliance in transshipment. All this is, of course, based on industry feedback. While we may have not found the panacea to address the perennial government-industry divides, we are closing the gap. The other important factor is multi-agency cooperation. We work closely with the Customs, Police, Multimedia Communications Commission, Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Health, Atomic Energy Licensing Board, and such. So clear demarcation of functions and responsibilities are essential. In Malaysia, should there be overlaps between other laws and the Strategic Trade Act, the Strategic Trade Act prevails. This is clearly defined in our law, but admittedly, this is not as easy as it sounds. Again, good working relationship is important. All agencies are involved at every level of the implementation. For example, when the EU, US, Japan, Australia provide us with the capacity building programs in export control, they are attended by all agencies. Major decisions and policy calls are made with the involvement of all agencies. There is also an interagency committee that meets frequently to discuss issues and to update on progress. The Strategic Trade Secretariat in the Ministry of Trade is the focal point that brings everyone together. Challenges persist, of course, in human resource, high turnover rate of personnel, especially in enforcement, as well as lack of awareness. But our general disposition is aligned with the task of ensuring safe and secure trade while not unduly affecting the economic interest of our nation. So, in a seamless trading environment with global supply chains, business has no border. This also means security threats to trade are borderless. And again, it also means any impact to legitimate trade is not localized. We are all linked in such a dynamic trading environment. Implementing export controls effectively, no matter how complicated, is really essential. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very interesting intervention. So we have two very thought-provoking presentations already, and I look forward to a third one from Spencer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to look at this from the WMD side and from a company that's involved in nuclear trade, amongst other things. And I want to look at areas and ideas on how government and industry can work together. I think we all know that the legal programs have relied heavily on procurement across borders and often involve companies and front companies and brokers. And preventing and obstructing that procurement is proven to slow the development process of WMD programs. But for business can provide quite a lot if it's actually given a reasonable direction. And there's incentives to do it, both from reputational purposes and also issues about the sanctions that would follow inadvertent supply. We've seen on the nuclear side quite a lot of supply chain growth over the last few years as people realise that there are programs out there that they could be involved in. I mean, there are three things. There are still new builds, even though we've had Fukushima. There's trying to patch up plants that you've already got, which will need to survive further years. And there's also quite a market now, I suppose, in decommissioning in some parts of the world that weren't there beforehand. The supply chain, I think, is very diverse. We've got private companies, we've got state-owned companies, we've got large ones, small ones, medium-sized ones, and because it's now a global supply chain, there's a wide geographical spread. And so that's very difficult to manage. gone are the days where you can find that one company in one country can do absolutely everything for all the orders it's got. I mean, those days are gone. And what we've found is that there's been a lack of awareness and clarity on quite a lot of the supply chain on what the controls are. And I think there's a lot more that government can do with industry engagement. I mean, outreach to other countries is sexy and it gets the money, but often in-reach to your own business doesn't get the same sort of effort, or within the EU the same sort of funding that you could generate for doing something outside those borders. So there's quite a lot that governments could do to support the counter-proliferation effort by ensuring that its businesses know where they can find information. For instance, information on what is controlled, how you apply for licenses, what sanctions are, what embargoes are, how you'd recognise an illicit program if one sort of came up, what are end users of concern, and how you can find information about them. There's all those sort of areas that can be looked at and developed. It's also difficult, but not impossible, for governments to reach out to its industry and actually target those that are operating in particular sectors to tell them more about what the controls mean and how to look out for things. There's also a need, I think, more to involve appropriate businesses in discussions on what's actually on the export control list, because companies tend to know what their products are and what they can do. And there is, in some areas, a lack of that. It's less so in the Wassenaar arrangement, I think, where you have a very long-term and established list review process, and industry has been involved in that quite heavily. But in the other export control regimes, there tends to have been less of that, I think. If you look at the EU, close to home, Annex 1, the list of dual-use items, hopefully now we've got over the logjam, and that will be produced on a regular basis, because it hasn't been produced on a regular basis now for quite a few years. It used to be the gold standard of export control. Everybody was asked to refer to the EU dual-use list. But they can't do that now. So there's a number of countries are having to make their own judgments on what the changes to the regimes have been. And I think that then leads to a disparity on what's being controlled, because people are interpreting it differently, because they haven't actually got any help from anywhere else to do it, except try and work it out for themselves. We often find, sitting from an industry point of view, that there is actually differences in interpretation between what is meant by a control list entry. Some states will say something is controlled, other states say it isn't. If you look at the category 0 on the dual-use list or the trigger list, you'll find that there's a debate on, is it an indicative list or a definitive list? It doesn't actually list everything that's there for control. So are you just going to use it as one or the other? Because if you use it as one or the other, then you're going to get disparities in what people think is controlled. Because if it's not actually on the list, some people will say, well, no, it's not controlled. Another thing that industry really needs, I suppose, is for the governments to be adequately resourced to cope with the licensing burden. I know that governments in times of economic hardship have a lot of calls on their personnel and finances and so on, but this is an area that does need to be properly funded and resourced, so that in fact you do get the correct licensing decisions, because there's enough people there to actually assess things correctly. Business can do a lot, because I think what we have is a better idea of complex supply chains than governments do. I mean, when I made the transition, I was really surprised at just how mind-bogglingly complicated purchasing departments have got the supply chain. And if you look on the nuclear side, you find that there are all sorts of licenses and things that you would require in order just to bid for a contract, let alone actually win it and deliver it. And when we talk about industry and its knowledge, there's another area that I found that's crept in, and I ought to stop soon. But and that is the recognition that industry can do a lot. So let's encourage industry to take a greater role in strengthening the application of export controls. And let's do this by inventing codes of conduct and partnerships and dialogue. And that's great. But there are a lot of organisations out there that are now doing that in the nuclear field. And so we've got to be sure that what we don't find is that we did, I think, in some stages in export control outreach, that you actually have organisations competing to deliver the same message to industry. You know, because, I mean, if we look at this, we've got the NSG guidelines, we've got what the 1540 Committee are doing, we've got what King's College are doing, we've got the Carnegie Principles. There are a whole range of these things out there. And so I think in some respects this does need some degree of coordination to ensure that industry doesn't get, if you like, non-proliferation fatigue. And on that point, I'll leave it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Spencer. So the speakers have been quite disciplined, and we still have about 15 minutes for discussion. So with that, I open the floor to the audience. Who would like to go first? Carlo, Ambassador?
First of all, I'm impressed by the large audience to this meeting, because export control usually is not a very sexy issue, and it's good to see that it attracts attention. Very, very comprehensive presentations. What I feel the duty to indicate is that the names or the export control regimes, existing control regimes, have been mentioned, but maybe the EU audience should know a little bit more about them, because they are basically in the same business as 1540, and they have been established before the resolution. And indeed, a cooperation between Resolution 1540 and this regime exists, but it is not fully recognized. The three regimes, or four if you include also the one Wassenaar arrangement on conventional weapons, are the MTCR on missiles, the Australia group on chemical and biological, and the NSG for nuclear. Now, these regimes have not been very popular, especially in the framework of the United Nations, because they are considered a little bit as a prerogative of developed countries, trying to keep their technologies to themselves. But I think that their evolution has been in the sense of opening up to the international community, to outreaching as much as possible, and and including in their membership also countries which are not the traditional Western countries. So at this point, one wonders what is happening, for instance, in 1540 committee. does the names of NSG, MTCR, and Australia Group, are they still a taboo, or is there a certain increased interest in them, also in view of the fact that, for instance, Resolution 1540 bases its export control on the lists which are made by these regimes. So this is basically the question that I address in particular to Kai Kiessler, with whom we have discussed this earlier, but not in this framework. Thank you.
Could you just introduce yourself briefly? I should have mentioned that, please, all of you.
Yes.
Thank you.
My name is Carlo Trezza. I'm presently the chairman of Missile Technology Control Regime. Thank you.
Yes, that was Mark. So please, if everybody introduces themselves first and then make the intervention.
My name is Mark Hibbs. I'm from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Angelina, thanks for your very detailed comments of how your system works. It was very good to hear this. A question for you in regard, actually, with what Carlo just said. Malaysia is a member of the non-aligned movement. But somewhere along the line, Malaysia experienced a change of view about this issue. And strategic trade controls became important for your country. And I'd be very interested in anything you can tell us about to elucidate what that process was politically and culturally in Malaysia. How did that happen?
Yes, my name is Sandro Zero from Arriva. I'm Export Control Officer for Arriva Industry. Congratulations for the panel. Excellent, very balanced, excellent chairman. And here we have represented all the institutions, national or industry view. My question would be, besides the fact that we meet today, do all those organizations meet more often to organize, to modernize, to cooperate and coordinate the three efforts between industry, governments and institutions?
Thank you. My name is Christian Rengifo with UX Consulting Company. I have a question for Angelina too, please. I think you mentioned that there's a process to redefine the definition of brokering or brokers. I'm very interested in knowing how you deal with brokering companies, because they're a very important aspect of the trade in export controls. Thank you.
We first have responses from the panel, and then we can do another round of questions. Who would like to go first? Okay, Angelina? Angelina, ladies first.
Okay. Okay, so your question first. What actually happened was, I think this could be in 2006. I'm not very sure about that, but I know about the case. There was this SCOMI case that Malaysia, 2003, yeah. So you know the answer.
I've been to your country and I've been to the place where it happened. So.
Okay, so do you want to answer that?
No, but in the broadest sense, something happened in your country.
So that was a trigger point where we were inadvertently involved in the AQ Khan network, supplying centrifuges for Libya's nuclear program. Apart from that, I would say that things started escalating after that, and we were viewed as a transshipment hub for illicit trade, especially to Iran, because of frontline companies. And since our trading, we are right smack in the middle of a trading route, and it's easy. We actually open up to the rest of the world from Southeast Asia. We are a gateway. So we are exposed to certain risks that other economies are not exposed to. So when these things started coming up, of course, scope is one case that opened up a Pandora's box, I would say. And because of this, we also had very strong political will. Our Prime Minister, no less than our Prime Minister, gave the assurance that we will be implementing the export control in 2010. And it was done by the end of 2010. So when the Ministry of Trade received that book, the law implemented. 2011, we were supposed to implement it. So it was very fast, a very, very fast, swift process. So I guess it's an escalation of sorts from a specific event, which opened up our eyes to how we were being viewed as a transshipment hub. And then we got a very strong political will to start it off. So that's how it changed. As for the other question, I'll just finish it. On the definition of brokering. Well, if you recall just now, I think Kai said that the EU, they're very shy of sharing their best practices. Well, in Malaysia, we've been fortunate that they have not been too shy with us. We've had lots of capacity building programs in the EU, from the EU. And we are actually looking into using the legal text of the EU, in fact, for redefining our brokering activities. Because at present, it is inclusive of bankers and all these ancillary services, which does not make sense. We simply cannot implement brokering controls on such services. We want to target the real, the people who we want to target. We don't want, usually what happens in laws, I mean, based on my experience is, we implement laws hoping that we will plug some holes. But then those who are caught, the first, when you cast the net, the first fish that come in are all those legal, law-abiding citizens. And they are up in arms and they're so annoyed. Why are you doing this to us? But I guess that's the process that we have to go through. First, you you clear that, we learn, they fight, they scream at us, and that's fine. It's all for good. So that's what's happening. We've caught everyone. We didn't catch only the fish that we want to catch. We've caught all the good fish as well. And they're not happy. They want to keep swimming. So this is why we have to redefine our brokering, and it also means how we implement and enforce it. So the practical ways in which we implement, we have to know what we're doing. So we are still in the process. I hope that answered your question. All right.
So it's Kai next.
If I may add something to your experiences, why Malaysia made this step, because I remember Sibylle and I were very involved in that at some point, and for us it also came as a surprise. Suddenly everything went well, the political will was there, but two things that I think I can mention from the external side. I think what we also realized is if you want to establish something, you need what was there in Malaysia. You have to have some champions or some driving forces, some people who are really pushing the process. I think that's what we saw, which was very helpful. And also, it didn't prove to be and you mentioned how you organized the interagency cooperation. In Malaysia, I think you did it from the beginning, and I think that also very much facilitated the process. At least that was my experience in working with you guys. So that there were two instances I think that should be mentioned as success factors in implementing effective controls. Ambassador, I'm not a diplomat, so I have to be very careful what I'm saying here. Let's put it this way. I think the open membership questions involving members of the of the 1540 Committee don't help in terms of the regime thing. And I was surprised to find out that all these old perceptions of the non-transparent processes still exist. Now, myself with the export control background, well, you are the driving forces in bringing change and having the discussions. However, what I also note is what is really missing, and that's also maybe why 1540 has developed to some kind of an export control focused thing. If you see, the first reports were only on export controls mostly, because there was nothing on the international level, no international driving force, no international organization which could take up the discussions and involve everyone. So I'm still puzzled to a certain extent that these perceptions persist. At the same time, the NSG, the MTCR have offered their resistance. They can also, and the NSG has recently done that, actually provided an example of effective practices. They have notified this to the committee, and the committee will probably share this on their website. So there are steps and ways, and we'll see how it develops. But it's still a tricky issue. Finally, Sandro, you mentioned something, coordination of efforts. And maybe I can take this up also what Spencer mentioned with the proliferation of non-proliferation standards. Again, it's very difficult in the absence of an international body, I guess, especially in the export control field. But, and here I'm very selfish, used the 1540 mechanism for that. It's a great platform. You can put everything under that. And I mentioned this effort by the Germans to establish some kind of a dialogue with industry. Well, the intention was really, first of all, of industry being able to share with regulators what they are actually doing. So we had last year a conference on biosecurity, where there was the intentional effort to have them talk about codes of conduct in the synthetic biological field. There's a lot of things happening also in industry, but regulators need to be aware of that. And again, the 1540 platform is a good platform for sharing that. I think the next conference, which will take place also together with the, I should mention that there's also the Office for Disarmament Affairs as a co-organizer of that, will actually talk to compliance officers and also ask them for their opinion on what can be done to allow for a better implementation in companies. So there's small steps, but so the 1540 committee, again, is a good platform for that, and you're free to engage.
Spencer, would you like to add some comments?
Well, I'm glad that you feel, Kai, that the 1540 committee can help to sort of bridge some of those gaps. Be interesting to see how your conference works out, and I wish you success on that. When
you'll get an invitation, you know that.
So it'll be my fault if it doesn't work. Okay. So, yeah, I've on your question earlier about what made Malaysia get religion. I also remember really what got Hong Kong to get religion, which was probably the first one in the area to do so. And following the handover, they realised that if they didn't implement a strong export control system, they were going to have real difficulties if they wanted to continue to be a transit point that people would use, and two, a state which would receive the high-tech products that they required, particularly to service some of their financial industries and some of the other high-tech sectors that they've got there. So if they didn't do it, they wouldn't get the item. So it was in their own self-interest to develop a strong export control system, which you could also argue is something for industry, really. If it wants to be trusted, it's in its self-interest to be able to demonstrate to governments and others that it knows what it's doing.
Great. New round of questions. The first row, then the second, then the third row, actually. We can go down.
My name is Scott Davis. I'm with the U.S. State Department. My question is for Kai. I work primarily on the Biological Weapons Convention, and if I heard you right, you said that only 20 UN members have not reported on their implementation of the 1540 requirements. which is quite notable because in the BWC we have a confidence building measure process which calls on states to report on a number of relevant activities and facilities and so on, as well as a database for national implementation. And the participation in each of those is quite disappointing. So it leads me to want to ask you to what you attribute the higher success rate on reporting under 1540. One could look at the legal dimension and say that, as you pointed out, that it's a Chapter 7 resolution and therefore it's legally binding. Although I wonder, and I'd be interested in your answer, to whether the reporting itself is considered legally binding. In the BWC, the parties to which, of course, are legally bound by the convention, the reporting, the CBM process, is voluntary, and reporting under the National Implementation Database is voluntary. So there's a difference. But I'm curious to know what the situation is with 1540 in terms of the binding nature of reporting, and beyond that, to what you would attribute the higher success rate. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I would like to join my colleagues also to congratulate the speakers for the excellent presentations. My question is to Kai on the 1540 committee. He has made mention of the tasks of the committee, ranging from monitoring the implementation of the resolution, supporting member states in terms of the implementation of the resolution, and also compiling best practices in terms of the implementation of the resolution. I would like, in specific and concrete terms, some of the key strategic supports that you provided to Africa, given the context of terrorism that is ravaging some key countries in Africa, particularly the West African countries. We are all living witnesses to what is currently happening in Nigeria, where the rebels are almost taking over the northeastern part of the country. Are you actually, monitoring the events there? Are you giving the strategic support that is required to the government? And if not, why? And if yes, what are the steps that you took? And secondly, the regional organizations are also playing key roles. What specific responsibilities have you, for example, provided or considered for, like ECOWAS? I work with the ECOWAS Commission. There are a lot of activities that we are carrying out, but we have never had any close liaison, for example, with the committee. So these are my two preoccupations. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you just pass exactly right behind you? Perfect.
Thank you. Pierre Goldschmidt from Carnegie Endowment. I'm sure, Angelina, that Malaysia has a very good export control organization today, but it's not the first time that I hear a country claiming that they have the best export control in the world. So my question is to all panelists, is there or should there be an international independent organization evaluating export controls in each country and rating them, reporting on their effectiveness? That's it.
Thank you. Volker Beck from Germany. I'm a little bit involved in outreach activities on these issues, and as Kai already said, I was involved also in the 1540 committee. Coming back to, I think, the comments on the regimes like Wassenaar and MTCR and the cooperation, or how this fits inside 1540, and that's not only 1540 but also the Biological Weapons Convention, Chemical, and the NPT. I think it's very clear that the international treaties say they're providing the legal obligations what states should do, but they don't tell how Kai said. Say they what to do, but not how to do it. and I think filling the how to do it is exactly a part where the regimes contribute, because they in detail tell how you could implement and what procedures you should use by controlling exports or even other type of activities like border control. The only thing is, I think, and that is where I think these regimes have to do more on this, is to leave this present status of closed shops. I understand why they are, because they are not only providing the best practices, but they also have inside information exchange, which is highly sensitive because they don't want to be undercut, that somebody gets the information and then takes the business from another one that has not delivered. But I think if you see today what the states doing in implementing their own national export control activities and their own organizations, to be more sensitive how good they improve, and to ask them if they have improved, and if you can rely on, can be confident that they will follow the no undercut policy of these regimes, to join these regimes and widen up, I think, these activities inside the regimes. And that is an issue, I think, that needs to be done more proactive by these regimes, and not only looking back and say, no, we don't have the confidence up to now, and therefore we cannot agree that other countries come in. I think, but that is something that for the future could improve the whole systems in export control internationally.
Okay, so we had a good round of 4 questions, and I'd like to go back to the panel. Maybe we start again with Angelina, but I should actually mention that I didn't hear Angelina say that you have the best system, but they do clearly top the ranking of the harshest penalties, because there's a death penalty for export control violations in Malaysia, which I don't think any other country in the world has. So, but with that introduction, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, and we are not too proud about that, actually. I'm sorry if I sort of gave a wrong impression. But if you think my export controls are good in Malaysia, then thank you. Well, so to answer your question, do I think there should be a body regulating? Right, that's what you said, to check whether effectiveness, evaluating the effectiveness of. Well, isn't that what Kai is doing? No, no. All right. I think I would like to just quote Spencer, if I may. This non-proliferation fatigue. If you have more organization, something more coming up, I think we have enough, sufficient organizations. And also, to quote him, I think when it comes to export control or strategic trade management, it has to come because of self-interest. If a country has an interest, a stake in implementing it effectively, then I think half the battle is won. You don't have to sit and check and evaluate them, because once you have somebody else evaluating you, I think it will cross over certain issues, sensitive issues, because the trading environment is different in each region, and the way that some things we can speed up, some things we'll have to sit and wait. So how we prioritize certain issues in certain regions is very specific, and it has to be customized. So I don't think an organization that evaluates or gives marks and gives stop marks to any country is going to help, because I think it's only going to make it worse, because there's this trust issue going on here. And if you have somebody watching over your back, even now, I don't think that's a good idea. What is good, in fact, is if we get help, if we get support, like how in Malaysia's instance, and once again, I'm not saying we have the best export controls, but we have lots of support from donor economies, like from the US, the EU, from Australia, from Japan. And when we interact with these economies and with these countries, when they come over, when they explain about their export controls, and when they are doing that, they're not pushing it down our throat. They're not saying that you should do it our way. What they do is, this is how we do it. Maybe you could consider it. And when we get approached, when somebody approaches us with this kind of a cordial kind of approach, I would say, you are more open to suggestions. As opposed to someone who comes, this is the checklist, you better get it done, this is the deadline, I'm going to come back next year. Too bad, maybe you want to transfer out of this division, but I don't care, we're coming back now. So, it's just psychological, I would say. This is my personal view. I think what's going on has worked for Malaysia. And what could be better, of course, is for us to be, for Malaysia to now participate and speak to our regional countries, our partners, which is what we're doing. As I'm sitting here, we have a delegate from Thailand, actually, but I think the time zone is different. They would have left by now. We have a delegation from Thailand coming to the ministry, the Strategic Trade Secretariat, to learn how we do things, because they are also at the brink of starting something. So this started something off. So if Dr. Sibylle or Kai had come over with a checklist and told us we have to abide by this year, I don't think we would be welcoming the Thai delegates today. We would be busy doing checking, or we would go and, I don't know, police other people. So my answer is, I think it's good how it is. We can enhance this by further cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll hand over to Kai.
Thank you. Let me start with Scott. Thank you for your question. Voluntary or legally binding? Well, the resolution says it calls on states. So my interpretation is it's voluntary. The states who say it's legally binding. But still, so I think the general understanding, it's a voluntary thing. Why successful? Well, 1540 is something that everybody somewhat can agree on. Non-state actors, terrorists. So that's something it opens doors. And that's also maybe a good advantage of 1540, that we are somewhere between non-proliferation and counterterrorism. So you can, it plays well with a number of states. And I mean, there is 10 years of outreach efforts before that. So the committee and the expert groups, ODA, did a great deal of doing this very cooperative approach. And I think one of the success factors is also that 1540 is a Chapter 7 resolution, but it's not a sanctions committee. So there's no investigation going on. It's really an invitation. Please tell us what you have done. And also there's been a lot of effort to get these last countries which are not reporting. One other success factor is probably that there is no template on how you should do reports. So it's not like the CBMs with a questionnaire, so people can do whatever they want. That also leads to reports which are just one page and saying we don't do anything, or these are our laws. And also the challenge that we are now facing is it's more and more difficult to get updates on these reports. So we have some countries that reported in 2004. And we'd like them because something has developed in this in this area, and we'd like the states to talk about this. Sani, thank you for your question on Africa. There is a lot of efforts there. First, I should mention that the 1540 committee itself and the experts don't provide direct assistance. We simply do not have the resources. And you quoted the many talks that the committee has. So to give you an idea, the committee, these are the 15 states which are in the Security Council, and you've got 9 experts. Currently, we're only 6 because it's always a recruitment process. So you've got all these tasks, so we cannot go out and do assistance. So we rely heavily on others to do the assistance job. The US has great programs, the EU has great programs, and especially for the region and Africa, there's been a lot of efforts now from the African Union to get engaged, and to my understanding, they've also involved the region organizations like ECOWAS. They have been quite fortunate that the last committee chair was from South Africa, so there is somewhat a process. We also see now that the regional office of the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs in Lomé has taken a stronger role, which also helps because they can work on networks. There's actually now efforts and something which I found I mentioned that we may need to adapt some of the traditional concept export controls. And the last meeting of the African Union on 1540, there was actually, they decided, or no, there was a conclusion, well, we should work on developing an African concept on export controls. And so there's now an effort, and we have one member state who's offered to host a workshop, and we are really hoping that there's now a process starting, again, with different partners in the region, and you'll be surely involved in that. It's also, and I'm strictly speaking my personal opinion here, you may also have great advantages in linking the 1540 process to the ATT process, for example. I see, I was very happy to see the EU assistance program on ATT implementation has a clear link to 1540 implementation, which is great because, well, it's at the end it's the same people who have to implement that. So why not do it at the same time? In terms of counterterrorism, our colleagues from the counterterrorism committees are very engaged in Africa. So we're trying to support their efforts. So when you talk about Nigeria, so there is a lot of effort, and so we try to coordinate because it's a lack of resources. I hope that is concrete enough. Talked long enough, sorry. And Mr. Goldschmidt on the need for an independent evaluating body. So no, Angelina, the 1540 committee doesn't evaluate or assess because there are no international standards, and personally I don't think it would be wise to do that, because what I think is export control systems have to fit the country. They have to fit the situation. It looks much more different from a major exporting nation like Germany, where there is a great need to have a licensing authority with 200 people, especially technical expertise. But this doesn't apply to Grenada. So it would be very difficult to come up with standards, and I think Sibylle and I have tried many times to actually just measure success in implementing export control capacity building, and it's simply difficult because there's also a number of things that you simply cannot see. I think that's also the problem of many licensing authorities. Mm-hmm. Well, the success rate, you can't really see it. You're pushing people in the illicit trade, but it's just very difficult how to assess the really a success by preventing non-proliferation. Well, you delay it. I think there's an understanding of that. That being said, there is a need for more cooperation, international cooperation, I think, and Angelina, I think that's great what you mentioned about Thailand. What I found quite interesting is there's still a lack of international conferences on export controls. If you have some, there's one done by the US. They're very much focused on outreach, on raising awareness on the issue, but it's not really an area where you discuss trends and issues. So I'm missing somewhat a global forum where you can exchange information, where you can discuss trends, where you can establish networks. And one thing that I found, which I'm also calling for, Japan is hosting for 15 years now, no, for 20 years, the Asian Export Control Conference. Once a year, they bring together people from the whole region. I have not seen another region doing that. I'd like to see champions go out and say, let's do it in Latin America, let's do it in Africa. Even the EU is spending a lot on outreach, but very few money is spent on in-reach. So there's also a lack, although the EU has formalized these mechanisms, so there is a lot of cooperation going on, but still, these possibilities where you establish networks, where you talk to people, where you exchange effective practices, I think there's still more potential for that.
Thank you, Kai. Spencer?
Okay. I think the problem with what I refer to as strategic export control, which covers the areas that we're interested in here, is that we've had a situation where you've got overarching treaties and other instruments which are very thin on detail, and then countries have to fill in the detail for themselves. So in some respects, the export control regimes were filling in the detail for those treaties for a group of countries. But So really what you've got, though, is a situation of a bottom-up approach to export controls. Everything is done on a national level to fulfill your international commitments. Now, if you look at another couple of areas, conflict diamonds and CITES, that's flora and fauna, things were done the other way round. The whole thing was agreed at an international level, the documentation you would use, how you would do it. And the whole thing was a package which went top down. So everybody does the things the same way. And that's the difference, I think. They were reasonably, conflict diamonds was about the time of 9/11, I remember doing something on it then. And so it started just before then and finished about a year after. That's the Kimberley process, as some people know it. But what we've got a system which is very disparate. And if you talking, for instance, in the export control regimes and the Wassenaar arrangement about ways of doing things, you'll tend to find that people will want it referred to as non-binding best practice because they want to continue doing it their way and they don't mind if others do it a different way, but that will be up to them. And there's even that, I think, in the EU to a certain level, that people are used to doing things in one particular way and they don't particularly want to do it in another way. And that's why you have, for instance, still on the dual use side, a regulation which is directly applicable in all member states, but there's a lot of areas where people approach it differently. And it is the problem that it's bottom up. Should we have a body? Well, I think virtually every government would think that was far too intrusive. Whether you have a sort of international standard, maybe something different, a series of things that people could benchmark themselves against. And in some respects, the questions that the 1540 committee poses, you could argue was a sort of benchmark, because you've taken a very small resolution which was very short on detail and said, well, this is actually what those commitments mean in practice. So you could use the 1540 thing as a checklist, particularly on the WMD side, not necessarily on the conventional side. And when you're talking about international standards as well, there's also a view that company compliance should be regulated in some way, and there should be perhaps some sort of international standard on that. So perhaps you could go for it on both sides of the house, and then everyone would know what everybody else should be aspiring to.
Good. We have time for a last round of questions. We're three on this side, actually. Well, Mark, you already had a go, so let's start in the back this time. So. Yes. No, Willem, yes.
Willem Janssens, European Commission. First of all, with the chance of beating the coordination question to death, I want nevertheless to come back to that topic, but from a little bit different point of view, because we spoke about coordination for making the standards, the regulations and so on. But I wanted to put on the table the question on the coordination or the collection, if you want, of the proliferation relevant information from export controls. And if I look at it from the nuclear area, where is that flowing together with the information on the nuclear materials concerns on clandestine facilities, for instance? You know that some of the techniques which are used for the investigations, trade databases or open source information, there might be similarities to us, and I don't know whether we have IAEA colleagues in the room, apart from Pierre as responsible in the IAEA, but we have lots of discussion in the safeguards area, at least, on state-specific factors, on country analysis. So the question there is really, how can we achieve a body or a mechanism where the proliferation relevant information which can be collected from an export control system flows together with the other proliferation indicators that we gather. And then perhaps a short reply, as I have the word on Kai, where he was correctly saying so that we should have more initiatives on the in-reach in the EU, but the problem is in fact that our member states give us lots of money for the outreach. Unfortunately, our DG Trade colleagues, even if they would be very much willing so, they have very limited budgetary economic means to do it. So we will have to find possibly a mechanism where the states do it on their own funding, but not with extra Commission funding. You were.
Yeah, but I think there are. Sorry. Yeah, good afternoon. Brunel Battistella from the World Institute for Nuclear Security. I would like to hear your thought about the relationship between the industry and the regulators. Because, so it's maybe more a question for Spencer, but I'm sure everyone can actually contribute. You mentioned the need for the industry to share information with the regulator about what they do, and I completely agree with that, but are they actually willing to do it? How does that work? And if they're not really willing to do it, what are the incentives? Thank you.
Well, first, Kai, I'm thrilled to hear that this went through and that you got effective practices from the NSG. Back in 2011, we held a conference for the PGs of the NSG, and we made 60 recommendations. That was one of them. So we're very happy that that happened. The question I have for you is going back to the role of 1540. In the larger sense, is there anything you are doing or can do, in your view, to facilitate a dialogue among the mechanisms to see how things are going? Because there's a lot of stovepiping in this area. In particular, in the area of compliance, adherence to guidelines, and discipline of membership. These are, in many cases, voluntary regimes, but there's lots of cases where things happen that aren't supposed to happen, and it might be a good idea for someone that has their fingers in all the pies and all the regimes, as you may, to have some kind of a role to play in facilitating a discussion to get good practices or experience shared among the mechanisms in this crucial area. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much. Mike Riley from the UK. Kai you mentioned at the beginning about one of the challenges with 3D printing, and I was just wondering, in terms of the future challenges, and how we horizon scan with industry, and perhaps that's something from the Rolls-Royce perspective. That's also another area where we might look at. How do we ensure that we stay that one step ahead, so that we can project where industry is going next with such a fast-moving technological developments going on in printing, in high-tech manufacturing, and to what extent these things can be moved very quickly across the internet, through cyberspace, from industry into non-state actors, and the risks around that. How do we ensure that we're always in that loop, we're picking it up, and we're responding effectively and coordinating effectively across government and industry?
Then I get to ask my question, actually. I wanted to ask the panel how we should call next year's session. If you don't like export controls, what would you call it? Thank you. So this time maybe we'll do it the other way around. We start with Spencer and Kai and then Angelina with the concluding round. Spencer?
Right, there's quite a few questions here, aren't there? First off, how can export control information get into the pot from individual states? I think it's a difficult one because every state has a different way of actually collecting information in its licensing databases. And then how do you actually transfer that information in another form to someone who wants it? So that, I think, is the real issue you've got to get over, because a lot of licensing authorities have issues over staffing levels and time to devote to things. And if you've got yet another reporting requirement in a format that doesn't actually work with the information you collect, then you've got a lot of a manual process in order to actually provide something. And that's when people start digging their heels in and kicking it into the long grass and not wanting to do anything. So it's those sort of things I think you've got to address, maybe by actually asking people what they actually do collect and how they collect it, and trying to find something which most people will do, and leave the other bits as just nice to haves. A core of information, and then other things that people could provide if they can provide it easily. Relationships between industry and the regulators. I think it varies depending on different which country you're in, and also the nature of the regulator and the regulated. In some countries, I think there's quite an open process where you feel quite confident in approaching your regulator. You can talk to them about things. It's not a them and us situation. I mean, for people like me who've worked on both sides of the spectrum, I have no compunction about ringing people up in government and talking to them, and not just the UK, elsewhere, because of people I've known, and I know they're not ogres and they won't bite my head off. Neither will they sort of take everything I say and hold it against me. It doesn't, but there is that sort of trust that doesn't exist where you've got two communities who never really interact together. So it is the case of trying to moderate that somehow. How do you share information on illicit procurement attempts? Well, it depends on whether or not your company has said, look, we've got a suspicious inquiry process, and after that suspicious inquiry process, we don't just take our suspicious inquiries, throw the piece of paper away and drop it in the bin. We actually tell someone about it. And the best person to tell initially is your own authorities. I think there are issues then on what your own authorities do with it and who they share it with. One of the things that the NSG measures promote is that industry sharing it with their supply chain. So there's a bit of both. But I think when you come to the industry sharing it in its supply chains part, you have to watch that your authorities don't say, hey, that is so sensitive, we'd rather you not say something because we want to investigate that a bit further. So, it is a process that you do have to invest time in. You can't force people to do it, but you hope they can see that it's sensible. How does government keep up on technology and what's going on? I think it does have to involve industry a lot more. In a lot of governments, I know from sort of my experience in the export control regimes over the years, if you looked at the size of the UK delegation, you looked at the size of the US delegation even, they have shrunk over the years. There is not the same level of expertise that was available inside government now than there was, say, 15 years ago. So you do have to rely more on industry to say, hey, we think this is a problem. You then have to listen to them, and then you have to decide which of the export control regimes, if you like, are you going to target that towards, and maybe the interfaces there aren't quite what they could be at the moment. I must say 3D printing, and I've also saw 4D printing list. I'm totally lost now. I can't, because I'm not technical at all. I'm a policy person. I'm just trying to visualise what you actually get from this. But I do take that point, but I think the way to do it is through closer dialogue with industry associations or individual companies and groups of companies. That's about the only way you can do it. Finally, what should you call this? Well, I mean, I think I referred to it as strategic export control beforehand, and that's a very much a UK expression. I don't know whether other countries use it to the same extent, but I wouldn't want to disguise it in calling it something totally different, and then people won't know what it says on the tin.
Thank you, Spencer. Kai?
Yeah, with the coordination regarding the information, Willem, I very much follow what Spencer said. You shouldn't forget the scarce resources in administrations, and as a licensing officers, I'm afraid of getting more information. It's difficult to administer and the reporting requirements. So that's something you have to be very, very careful in looking into that, because everybody calls very quickly for new information, but someone has to process the information and analyze the information. And unfortunately, and I think that's a big challenge that all of us face is that there is fewer resources for this area. I see, however, from the 1540 perspective, that probably that's where the IAEA has a great advantage, because they have the mechanisms to share this information. And I was glad to hear this morning the DG of the OPCW also mentioning that they are working on better systems to allow the information sharing. I think that's probably, if you have these mechanisms, that's useful. So I don't have an answer yet, because at the same time I see the challenge that you need to exchange more information, because that's what states usually ask for. Where do I get the information on denials? But we see the EU experience even within this very close-knit community. The number of years it took to come up with a solution how you can share denial information. It's a long process, and I'd hope actually again that the EU is talking about this a bit more, because nobody prevents any state to share information. That's also something. The staff piping issue, Mark. Yeah, that's. I guess 5040 is trying to. Well, they're doing this in a way, but it's also. We could do a better job, I think. I think in personal opinion, it should be the role of the experts to have the good overview of what's happening and to coordinate, or trying to bring people together, facilitate exchanges and these kind of things. It's just tremendously use of resources to do that. You cannot assume that the 1540 committee is kept up to date with information. You always have to request the information, and again, because everybody's has their job and their tasks. So now the 1540 committee asks more information on that. So it's again, I see the limits of that. Still, I'm thinking we try to do the job here. One example that we're looking into is. There seems to be now a proliferation of national action plans going on, and that's certainly something where we all, the EU, the IEA, the 1540 committee is really trying to look into that and see how the things fit together and to explain better how you do things, so that you can submit a CBRN action plan also as a 1540 action plan. Nobody is doing anything against it. But there are efforts, and again, the Office for Disarmament Affairs, who's supporting the 1540 committee in its task, and the experts, has also established a regular dialogue. We recently had a week where we brought together all the relevant international organizations, and where there was actually discussion on effective practices. There is also, again, the exchange of experiences on national action plans, on peer reviews. So there is a lot of exchange going on, and I'm glad to see that there's a lot of interaction going on. So it's a good sign, I guess. The 3D printing, I'm following Spencer again. That's something I think where industry needs to provide more more information or maybe can come up with a solution. I would also say, though, just because it's difficult doesn't mean you shouldn't try to control it. Because I think that the instruments that are out there, the things that have been developed under the heading of intangible transfers of technology, or there are already means for regulators to act on that. Not to act on it, but to use this as a motivation to start the dialogue with exporters on this issue. And I think that's definitely one where we have to look into. But so I think the instruments are in place, but that's why I was calling out to have a dialogue on that. And I think that's what needs to be brought into this process. We had the discussion on how should we call this what we're working in. I mean, I have the problem in German there is no translation for strategic trade controls. That's so the word Ausfuhrkontrolle or export controls is well established, and that's what I always used to say, that, well, everybody knows what export controls is all about. That's used in the resolution, the Export Control Organization in the UK, the EXPIS program, they all talk about export controls, and all the related activities are also export related. At the same time, I think now when I go back, when I think of my role as a licensing officer, and I'd like to take a pragmatic approach, I like the strategic trade management very much nowadays, because I know that Southeast Asian states it's a marketing trick, really. But at the same time, if I look at my reality as a licensing officer, what I do is I manage trade. You have to have efficient processes in place. And you have an approval rate of over 97%. So you have to be able to process things very efficiently. And I hope that's what we, for example, tried to show in Malaysia, that you shouldn't always look at the illicit things, but you have to be able also to deal with the simple things, because only if you do that, then you can have the time and to look at the other stuff. So it is very much, that's why I like maybe the management concept is a bit broader and better describes the job.
Thank you. So to conclude, Angelina.
Yeah, I'll make mine very quick, because I think the questions have evolved, the answers have all... Okay, just my comments on government-industry relationship. I think people who are sitting in the government, who are sitting in offices, should be well aware that we cannot tell businesses how to do their business. So if I knew how to do how to do my business better, then I would not be in the government, most likely. So we will have. I mean, we have to admit these facts, and I think there's the question of respect there. And if you respect and you have an open line of communication, then flow of information would be good. The other one is on collection of data. I would say how for Malaysia, it's so new that I don't think we have enough statistically significant data available. But how would you measure effective export controls? How many licenses you issue, how many licenses you deny, how many you didn't issue, what do you know, what don't you know that you don't know. There's so many questions. So I think that's another topic that you could consider. How do you measure? I mean, we don't want to measure and evaluate, but how do you determine what is effective export controls? That's something that we would really like to know. So of course, I agree with Kai. If you're having a conference in Southeast Asia, call it strategic trade management. If you're having it here, call it export controls.
Excellent. So with that, I would like to conclude this session, and I would first of all like to thank the panel for excellent contributions, very thought-provoking, plenty food for thought also for the rest of the year next year. And I would also like to thank the audience for very good questions and comments. So with that, the next item on the agenda is reception followed by dinner, and let's just thank the speakers also.